Hi, I'm Phil Craig.
And I'm Andrew Loney.
And together we aim to bring you the most scandalous stories and some of the most scandalous people in history. So thanks for joining us here on the Scandal Mongers podcast.
Well, I think Valentine was our most popular guest of the whole 27 episodes we've so far done, wasn't he?
He was. And I'm really pleased that he's joining us again. Talking of people who are joining us again, you might recognise where I am. Do you remember when we interviewed my friend Tim Clayton?
Oh, yes.
All about the scandalous Gilray and the gorgeous, scandalous Georgians. Well, I'm in his house, staying with him for the weekend.
And maybe we'll find out about more scandalous Georgians or no, it's what are they called now with Charles?
Carolans?
Carulians,
that's right.
Brilliant.
Yes, we're back to the royals again. And it's funny, I still get a certain amount of stick on social media for when we do royal subjects, even though they're very popular. Some people don't think they're as important or serious as, say, I don't know, Boris Johnson or the post office scandal or some of the other things we've done. I mean, both of us have spent quite a bit of our careers doing royal stories.
Well, because they're so popular, and I think there's a real gap there. I mean, few historians have looked at royal subjects, but I think we try to give a mix. And I think the great thing about Valentine Low is he's a very sensible, level-headed sort of historian. He's not one of those journalists who just sort of picks up tidbits.
True. Also, I'd say maybe in terms of the historical royal stuff that you've been doing, and perhaps also Charles and Diana, it is important. It's important because they're famous and people want to know what they think and what they do and what they represent. But it's also because they have a certain amount of power. I mean, real power, not just cultural power.
Exactly. No, I think it's one of the interesting things I'm finding with Prince Andrew is how he was used not just as a trade envoy, but also as a backdoor for intelligence activities. So I agree. I think the royal family really hasn't had the attention it deserves, given all the things that they do. We see the surface, but we don't always realize what's going on behind the scenes.
I don't think you've told our loyal army of listeners yet that you're doing an Andrew book, have you?
No. A revelation for this episode.
Yeah, well, that's something to look forward to.
Who knows what will happen on my social media now?
Andrew on Andrew. That's got to be a winner, I would think.
Yeah, he's an interesting man.
He is indeed. Well, yes. So Valentine's back. I suppose his biggest contribution to the story of the royals at the moment is he revealed all the courtiers complaining about the way Meghan allegedly behaved. And this came out around the same time as the Oprah Winfrey interview. And of course, she was making these allegations about how badly she was treated and suggesting there was racial prejudice in the royal family. So he became a really important part of that ongoing feud. And he's come up with a new edition of his book, which he's going to talk to us about. And he's particularly been digging into the relationship between Kate and Meghan.
Yes, I'm looking forward. I've read the serial in the Times. There's some, interesting new disclosures there.
Well, there you are. Okay, I think we should go to him. What do you say?
I think that's a good idea.
Okay, bye from Suffolk. See you later.
Bye from London.
Valentine, welcome back to our little show.
Thank you for having me on.
As you'll see, we're no longer in the palatial studios where you first met us. We've exiled ourselves to a sort of digital Montecito of Zoom. But it's great to have you back. Are you still feeling mischievous?
Never stops. Never stops.
Well, your book is certainly getting a lot of attention in paperback. You've added quite a lot of new material.
Yes. I mean, well, an awful lot has happened since I wrote the original version.
Right.
The Queen, the coronation, and so on.
And has anything changed? Have you had to revise your opinion about anything, or do you think you got it pretty right first time?
I think I got it fairly right. I've tweaked an opinion. The Princess of Wales, as we should now call her, the Duchess of Cambridge as she was, I learned something interesting about her, which actually goes back to the events already covered in the book. But it's always possible to glean new nuggets of information, and this was about the famous phrase, "Some recollections may vary," which was in the statement that the palace released on the Queen's behalf after the Oprah Winfrey interview. Now, a lot of authors have been claimed for that phrase. Obviously, it was not the Queen's own phrase. Well, not obviously, but it wasn't the Queen's own phrase. And it turns out that that was William's private secretary, John Christoph Gray. He came up with it. He only started the job just like about 3 weeks earlier. He was incredibly new to it when this whole Oprah Winfrey crisis came along. And if you remember, it was broadcast in America on a Sunday night. So those of us who were desperate to watch it had to sort of work out ways of somehow accessing American television overnight, Sunday into Monday, but it wasn't going to be broadcast in the UK until Monday evening on ITV. So all the hacks, we all have been paying attention and digesting and analysing every cough and spit of this programme coming into Monday morning. But most people in Britain won't have seen it yet. And the palace was very slow to react. They weren't saying anything. And it turns out the reason they weren't saying anything is the Queen was absolutely determined, whatever advice she got, she was not going to say anything until she had watched it along with everyone else on ITV that night, on the Monday night. Meanwhile, the palace apparatchiks, all the men in grey suits, were trying to sort of concoct a reaction and work out, what they should say about the programme. And they got a draft response ready. And it sort of tipped a nod a bit to the idea that, whether this was what Harry and Meghan had to say was true or not, but didn't really address that very strongly. And also had a phrase about, Harry and Meghan being much loved members of the family. And it was William and Kate who basically said they wanted it toughened up, that it should address the fact that they, the royal family, did sort of challenge the truth of what some of Harry and Meghan had to say. And they went away. This chap, John Christoph Gray, came up with this brilliant phrase, some recollections may vary. And then there was a debate about it amongst all the courtiers in the various royal households. And some people in other households were a bit nervous. They didn't think they should include it because they were worried that it would unnecessarily antagonize Harry and Meghan. But the person who was adamant that it should stay in was Kate, Duchess of Cambridge, as well as Prince of Wales, as is now, because she made the argument that, we've got to lay down a marker to say that we challenge some of this narrative, because otherwise it's just going to be accepted as true. And we've got the future reputation of the royal family to think about. And it shows a side of Kate that's not always appreciated, that she's far steelier than we think. We think of her looking lovely, wearing nice frocks, taking on good causes, but we rarely see the toughness. And the other thing is it's her strategic thinking. She's thinking about the long term. She's thinking about if we let Harry and Meghan control the narrative completely, that's what's going to be accepted forever and a day. And we've got to just make it quite clear that no, we, the royal family, do not accept everything that they said. It's very interesting.
Wow. I mean, nobody doubts the quality of your sources, Valentine. They're the best in the business. And you must have had some very interesting conversations laying behind the new edition of the book. But why do you think Kate was so exercised on that particular point? Was it because for the first time they'd been basically accused of having racist opinions in the family? Was that the key thing, or was it something bigger than that, going to her relationship maybe with Meghan?
It's hard to say. I think the racism thing was a big thing, because if you'll remember, a couple of days later, a television reporter doorstepped William at some engagement and asked me if he'd spoken to Harry, and then said, are you a racist family? And he said, no, we're very much not a racist family. And William, the royal family doesn't normally reply to sort of shouty questions from impertinent television reporters. So the fact that he was so moved to do so suggests that it was an issue he cared a lot about, because it was really bad at the time. I mean,
Susan Hussey was thrown under the bus, wasn't she,
yeah,
to sort of distance himself from this issue?
Yeah, it's a toxic issue for the royal family race. I mean, despite everything that the Queen, as was, and King Charles now have done positively in terms of race, it still they still come across as this very sort of white institution, not necessarily in touch with sort of modern multiracial Britain, and that's. Yeah.
So, sorry to interrupt. Have they tried to address that? I mean, are there signs that that's going to change?
Well, you've got to think of it in two different ways. One is what they do in terms of the issues they take up, and the causes they espouse. The Prince of Wales, when Charles was the Prince of Wales, I think he did an awful lot to engage with Britain. I mean, if you think about the Prince's Trust, it's there to sort of help young people, but it's helped an awful lot of young Black people over the decades that it's been around. I mean, Charles really has engaged with this, and he's done an awful lot to kind of address the questions raised by some modern, multiracial, multicultural Britain. But if you look at the palace as an institution, as somewhere to work, it hasn't really moved with the times. There's very, very few Black faces in there. I mean, and you notice them when they're, so Charles has employed a few, some. He had a senior woman in his communications setup who now does community engagement, Ava Williams, as she now is. He had a Black press secretary a while back, but not many, and very, very few in the late Queen's setup. I mean, she had a Black equerry relatively recently, but not much else beside. It's a pretty white establishment, and we're told that occasionally there are signs in the media, brief stories about there's going to be some appointments coming up soon that will start to change this, but they've got a long way to go. And I had an interesting conversation when I was writing this book with someone who had been extremely senior in the household. And this person said to me that they recognized this issue years ago, decades ago, and realized it had to be addressed. But this person accepted that very little has in fact been done over the intervening years, and is not quite sure why. But we all know you can have sort of cultural inertia, can't you? It's very difficult to change institutions. I mean, I look at my own industry, actually, the newspaper industry. My own newspaper, I mean, very slow to employ people from ethnic minorities, and certainly people from ethnic minorities in senior positions.
I mean, you have some very interesting points about the sort of structure of the Buckingham Palace and the organisation, and you talk about it not being like most organisations with a chief operating officer and a financial officer, but actually three sort of equals. And there's a bit of jousting that goes on between them, and presumably it makes it difficult to make change in decisions.
Yes, I think it makes it very difficult. Apparently, King George VI used to say, "Don't let anyone have too much power," so they couldn't, I suppose, they couldn't get above themselves and start causing trouble. But the result is, again, this kind of inertia, and I think it was seen at its worst in the Harry and Meghan problem years, when in a way, no one was really in charge of dealing with the problem. You had the people who worked immediately for Harry and Meghan, who were kind of aware of what was going on and struggling to deal with it. But the people ultimately in charge of the palace, I think there were personal difficulties between them and Harry and Meghan. I mean, Harry hated them and they hated Harry and Meghan, as they would certainly admit in private. But also there was no one person who's going to take charge of it and deal and just take the situation by the scruff of the neck. And if it had been addressed earlier, because the first signs that things were going wrong with Harry and Meghan were evident about a year before they left. If someone had taken charge of the situation then, I think it could have ended more happily. I think the result would have been the same. I think Harry and Meghan would have still left, but it could have been dealt with a lot better. And I think that's all to do with this strange sort of flat management structure where you have these various people in charge, but no one really is overall in charge. So you have, the Lord Chamberlain, who's like the non-executive chairman, and you have the monarch's private secretary, who's like a sort of chief of staff, and then you have the comptroller, who's in charge of ceremonial, and you have the keeper of the privy purse, who's the money guy, and none of these people, like for instance the privy purse, they don't think of themselves as being responsible to, say, the private secretary or whatever. They report directly to the monarch. So it's a chaotic structure in a way.
So and have we learned? Spoke to you, sorry, Andrew. When we first spoke to you, it was getting very nasty, wasn't it? From one side, accusations effectively of racism in the family. From the other, accusations of bullying, and a report that was commissioned and then buried. And it looked like trench warfare. It seems to me, 6 months on, have things calmed down a little? Have tanks been slightly withdrawn? Are things going quieter in California? Or where do you think that sits now, that sort of bitter confrontation?
I think it's much quieter now, mainly because Harry and Meghan have kind of said what they have to say. They can't keep repeating it. There's no merit in repeating it. They've had their platforms. I mean, the two major platforms being the Netflix documentary and Harry's book. And of course, occasional salvos will come in the court case. Harry's various court actions. Currently, we've got the one against the Mirror. There'll be references to the royal family there, but I mean the main brunt of their attack, we've seen that, and that's over.
So who's winning? Who's winning? If to be very crude about it, because it did look like a competition for global public opinion 6 months ago. Who's won that competition?
Well, certainly it seems that Harry and Meghan's star is slightly in the waning. But they seem to be less popular in the States than they were, and they're certainly having their problems because the way the Spotify deal came unwrapped, but I would just sort of sound a note of caution there, because for instance, when the Spotify thing, when they parted company with Spotify, all Harry and Meghan's enemies, of which there are many on this side of the Atlantic, particularly in the media, they all were absolutely delighted. But of course, Spotify was already having problems with its sort of podcast model and the idea of having celebrity podcasts. So it was as much a reflection on that as Harry and Meghan's sort of failure to do enough content or do the content they wanted. I think it was just about doing enough content. And also, everyone absolutely loved when the Spotify executive, Simmons, was very critical of Harry and Meghan in his own podcast. But you've got to remember that Simmons is a guy who's already been critical of them. So this wasn't a new person suddenly launching an attack on them. It was already someone who was already heavily critical. But, so one shouldn't get too excited about how the mood is changing, but I think it certainly has changed in the States. If you look at the opinion polls, they are much less popular than they were, because people get sick and tired of whinging. I mean, there's only so much negativity you can take, and you got to, if you want to be popular, you got to sell something positive.
And do you think that's what they're going to try and do now?
It's definitely what they've got to try and do. And we all had some fun, didn't we, when that story claimed that Harry's various pitches for podcasts, including interviewing Vladimir Putin, and the Pope as well.
Well, we tried to get him on here, but for some reason he never replied.
I thought you were having him on next week. I'm very disappointed. Yeah, I mean, the trouble is, that story, we don't know how good the sourcing is for that story, but it did have the smack of truth. It did feel as though this is the sort of thing that Harry would say, because that does chime with how someone who used to work for Harry described it to me. He said he's someone who would churn out 10 ideas, 9 of them would be bonkers and 1 would be great. So he's got, I've always considered Harry to be a person with no filter. It just all comes out, and what you see is what you get, and so you can just imagine him saying all this stuff, and some of these ideas will never work, but there'll be a gem in there somewhere. So I kind of believe I believe the Putin Zuckerberg interview idea.
I mean, do you think there's some element of entitlement that they don't seem to have sort of accepted, or some do, and some, Princess of Wales, William, seem to be very determined to follow a role of public service, where the others, Prince Andrew and others, and Harry perhaps, who still feel this strong sense of entitlement?
I'm not sure that entitlement is quite the word with Harry, certainly not in the same sense that is with Prince Andrew. I think Prince Andrew definitely has this world view that he was born into this position and therefore he deserves respect, whatever, attention. Harry is much more, he was born into this position. It's not his fault, and therefore he deserves and requires the protection that it becomes necessary, having been born to that position. I mean, I think it's not that he believes necessarily we should pay attention to him. After all, he one of the things he was always very conscious of in his sort of years as a sort of working role was this idea that he had a limited shelf life. And while he was young, people would pay attention to him, but as he grew older and as a new generation of royals, e.g. basically Prince George and his siblings, grew up, Harry would become less and less relevant. And I think someone who's got a strong, and therefore what he wanted to do was achieve as much as he could in the time that the world paid attention to him. I think someone who believes that, I think it's a little unfair to accuse them of a sense of entitlement. I think it shows an awareness of the ephemeral, passing nature of royal celebrity.
I think he's very ambitious, though. It's a different idea of service, isn't it? It's a more global model. Maybe it's a more digital age model, a more celebrity-driven model, the model that he thought he could brainstorm with Meghan. And to an extent, it's worked, but he just seems to be running out of road, and you sort of wonder where he goes next. I mean, I'm just a slightly sad figure now, I think, Harry.
I think he's definitely in danger of becoming a sad figure. I mean, the trouble is, I don't think being a sort of global celebrity is really what's good for him or what he ultimately deep down wants. But he's also used to the attention. I always think really that Harry would be much happier if, having left the military, he went off to work on a conservation project in Africa. I think that would be absolutely the right thing for him to do, but clearly not something that Meghan would buy into.
Prince Andrew once said that he wished to be a plumber. That was a useful skill to have. They are torn. But isn't it the problem we've got in sense of tension? Because the royal family, the king wants to streamline the royal family, and yet the demands on the working royals grow, and there aren't enough royals to go round. So what's the solution there? Do we expect them to do less, use the deputy lieutenants, or do we bring up the Beatrices and the Eugenies and the Lady Louises?
I'm not sure I totally buy this idea that the demands on the working royals grows. I think the workload is whatever the royals around can do, and it's not like there's a sort of fixed number of engagements that need to be covered by them. I mean, there are organizations and places who all would like a royal visit, but I think, as it were, if Staffordshire got a royal away day once every 8 years as opposed to once every 3 years, I'm not sure they would necessarily really notice or necessarily be any the poorer for it. I think, all those things that the kind of more minor roles used to do, the world can survive without those engagements being carried out, and I think the marginal difference, the appreciable marginal difference, is hard to notice and hard to quantify.
Right, interesting. And I mean, did you have people come to you after the book came out, prepared to talk to you, felt that this was a serious book which shone new light on the royal family? And do you feel sometimes that people are trying to use you, that people are spinning to you, that you're part of a briefing war that's going on? And how do you deal with that?
I think I have. Interesting. I've got some feedback from various sort of courtier-related people who basically give quite positive feedback, saying that I kind of got it more or less right, and which on the one hand is pleasing. On the other hand, you think, oh my God, have I not been harsh enough? Have I let them get away with it? And you constantly question yourself about whether you've got it right. But I think I've got it more or less right. And yeah, the idea of people using you, briefing wars, you're always aware of that. And you just have to make sure that whatever they tell you, you try and check it to the best you can. You try and look at it in the context of who they are and what story they want to tell. So, for instance, with Harry and Meghan, there were some people talking to me who, are not the greatest fans of Harry and Meghan, but you try and temper that. I didn't necessarily put absolutely everything in that they told me, and you try and temper that with what other things and try and produce a more balanced and nuanced portrait. I mean, I went out of my way not to make an attack on Harry and Meghan, and there are definite bits where I express sympathetic opinions towards them because they weren't always wrong.
Interesting. Since we've got you, can I try my theory out on you, Valentine? I was going back to Dimbleby's book on Charles, and there's lots in there where Charles is opining about how ridiculous his job is. A lot of it is trivial, it's silly. It is the Lord's second silver staff holder of Staffordshire opening some silly event, and it's making mindless chit-chat. And how he kind of pushes against that. He wants to do something significant, whether it's about medicine or the environment. And he, at risk of being a little bit ridiculous, he tried to do that. And maybe Harry's got a bit of that in him too, that he wants to be a significant figure. But then there are other voices, perhaps one of them is Camilla, perhaps one of them is Kate, who say, do you know what, guys? It is a bit silly what we do, but people like us doing it. Let's keep doing it for an awful long time. And then people love us like they love the Queen. So isn't that tension between striving for great importance and just accepting what we're doing is a bit silly, but people like it?
It's a tension that's always there. And I see it most vividly in Camilla, because she's a very friendly person. She knows the journalists, she knows our names, she talks to us, says hello. And if she's doing an engagement and it's very easy to catch her eye because she almost wants to have her eye caught. And there's a kind of twinkle in her eye that says, this is absolutely ridiculous what I'm doing right now, but let's soldier on and let's pretend it's all okay and makes perfect sense. It's a very kind of endearing quality she has. And they're always doing this. they will go and do an engagement or a series of engagements, which is always about often about something serious, something worthy, something, a cause or an issue that needs highlighting. And they know that if someone says something daft to them or they say something amusing, that will be the story, or the Daily Mail will focus on what Kate's wearing, or ridiculous things. And they just kind of hope that, okay, that's how it gets into the media, but the media will also talk about whatever it is, homelessness or, alternative meds, whatever the issue that they're going on. That's the compromise that always faces them, and they just kind of have to accept. And what's very noticeable with William and Kate, and I'm absolutely not saying it's not true of Charles and Camilla, but it's been particularly noticeable of William and Kate recently, is how they've got these projects which they are desperate to try and get attention for. So with Kate, she's got her early years centre. William recently launched this thing about homelessness to try and eradicate homelessness. I mean, God bless him, you can't fault him for lack of ambition. And they work very hard trying to get attention for that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, but the tension is always there, and it's not going to go away, because we the media, and ultimately we the public, can't be forced to pay attention to whatever good causes they want to promote. You have to be, your attention has to be wooed and sought and fought for.
Do you think there should be more coordination between the households? That, there've been tensions in the press, certainly, between William and his father, with one sort of upstaging the other. This coordination of publicity initiatives isn't always very clear.
Yeah, I mean, we saw that the other day, a few weeks ago, when William gave an interview to the Sunday Times, which made the front page of the paper on a day when I think Charles might have been hoping that the Trooping of the Colour would dominate the front pages. It's happened before. It happens now. It'll happen again. They coordinate fairly well, and I think, broadly speaking, relations between the households are okay at the moment. But I think there have been one or two moments of tension, certainly, and it's very hard to litigate against that.
I mean, what seems to be interesting is the role of Camilla, Kate, and Sophie Wessex sort of play, because in some ways they seem to have a surer feel sometimes for what's required in the job than the people who are born into it. I mean, is that a fair comment?
I think I think they're all slightly different. So I think what Camilla brings is a groundedness and a sense of the real world that Charles might lack. I think William is more grounded in reality than his father is, and therefore doesn't need that quite so much from Kate, which she definitely brings. She brings a reassurance to that relationship, and of course she was often the peacemaker, or tried to be the peacemaker with Harry. You saw that after Philip's funeral, when she kind of brought the brothers together. And Sophie Wessex, let's forget, she had a shaky start when she got stung by the fake shake, but she kind of brings a naturalness. I think Edward, he has his virtues, but he has been brought up in that royal cocoon, hasn't he? And she's worked in the real world, but she's a very engaging character. I think people warm to her. I remember once my wife, who is to do with education, they were going to get a visit, and they weren't quite sure whether it was by Edward or Sophie. And the word behind the scenes was, "Oh, let's hope it's Sophie because she's great." People like engaging with her. I mean, she goes down well with it whenever she does a visit, and I think that's what
it's just like Diana's time again, isn't it? The women are always more entertaining than the men in this family. Yeah. It seems to be. But final question for me. We are getting close to the end of our little Zoom slot. I mean, it seemed a while ago like a crisis. Opinion polls did seem to be moving against the royals. The Queen died. Everybody was surprised. I was surprised at how emotional that felt and how powerful that moment was. Yeah. And then the sort of Harry / Meghan / William and Kate melodrama has calmed down. Do you think the royals are in a better position now than they were a year ago?
I think it's certainly calmed down. I think reach a certain point of stability. The opinion polls are fairly steady. They're not always as great as they might be, but they don't show any catastrophic decline in popularity for the royals. I often get asked about, what I think about the long-term future, and I got a sort of pat answer for that is they're certainly good for another 50 years. Who knows what happens after that? I couldn't kind of guarantee what they'll be here in 200 years' time, but I think definitely they're good for the next 50.
50 more podcasts, Andrew.
At least. Well, we'll have to call you back sooner than that to see what the situation is. So thank you so much. You're always full of fascinating...
Yeah, well, you've got the best sources, mate, and we do appreciate you sharing them, and thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure. Lovely talking to you.
See you in 50 years.
Or sooner.
Thank you for listening to the Scandal Mongers podcast. This has been a Podcast World production. You can get in contact with our show by emailing team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandal Mongers in the heading, or via our social media links within the show's bio.